The light from 1,000 candles danced across the polished marble floor of Beaumont Hall. It caught on the jewels of the ladies and the polished buttons of the gentlemen, splintering into 1,000 tiny stars. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive perfume, hummed with the murmur of 100 conversations in the soaring notes of a string quartet. This was a world of effortless grace and immense wealth, a carefully constructed performance where every gesture held meaning. And in the center of it all, performing with the skill of a seasoned actress, was Baroness de Beatrice Vance. Her blonde hair was a masterpiece of curls and pins, her gown a cascade of emerald silk. She held a crystal glass of champagne, not to drink, but as a prop. A small, rapt audience of titled ladies leaned in, their expressions a perfect blend of sympathy and hungry curiosity. "It is a mother's heaviest burden," Beatrice said, her voice a practiced, sorrowful sigh, "to see one's own child so limited. Dear Eleanor, she has a sweet nature, of course, but the Lord saw fit not to bless her with a quick mind." She took a delicate, theatrical sip. "She cannot read a single word, not one. We have tried tutors, specialists, nothing takes." A woman with a feather in her hair, a viscountess whose name Eleanor had forgotten, made a clucking sound of pity. "Oh, my dear Baroness, how dreadful for you." "One does what one must," Beatrice continued, her eyes sweeping the grand ballroom as if searching for her unfortunate charge. "I protect her, naturally. The world can be so cruel to a girl who is, shall we say, simple. I keep her close. It is my duty, as her father would have wished before he passed." Her gaze finally landed on a solitary figure standing by the tall, arched windows. She gave a small, sad smile. There she is now, poor dear girl, entirely lost in a world she cannot comprehend. From across the room, Eleanor Vance felt her stepmother's gaze like a physical touch, a familiar prickle of ice on her skin. She did not turn. She kept her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked darkness outside, her reflection a pale, ghostly image against the black glass. She had learned long ago that reacting was a mistake. Any flinch, any tear, any flash of anger would only feed the narrative. So she stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her modest, dark gray gown. She was a shadow at the edge of a sun-drenched painting. The whispers followed her, as they always did. Illiterate, simple. The poor, unlettered Vance girl. She heard them, but the words had become a dull, distant hum, like the buzzing of a fly trapped in a jar. Inside her mind, the music and the gossip faded into a quiet, orderly space filled with numbers. Her eyes scanned the room, not with the vacant stare her stepmother described, but with a precise, analytical focus. 47 musicians, at roughly £5 an evening per musician. That was £235 for the music alone. The champagne, a fine vintage she recognized from her father's cellars, was being poured with abandon. 200 guests, at a conservative estimate of 2 glasses each, meant at least 67 bottles. At the Duke's cost, that was likely another £150. Her gaze moved to the towering floral arrangements, heavy with imported orchids and roses that bloomed out of season. The food, an endless parade of delicate pastries, roasted meats, and glistening jellies. The extra servants, the cost of the candlelight, the polish for the floors. Her mind worked silently, effortlessly, constructing a ledger of the evening's expenses. The total, she estimated, would be close to £900, a sum that could have funded her father's research for 3 years, a sum that represented more than the entire yearly income of the farms her father had left her, farms now managed and bled dry by the Baroness. A bitter taste filled her mouth, sharper than any champagne. This was the source of her stepmother's cruelty. Beatrice had married Eleanor's father for his name and his quiet wealth. When he died, she discovered his assets were not in liquid coin, but in land, research, and investments that required a keen mind to manage. A mind she did not possess. Worse, she had brought her own colossal debts to the marriage. To maintain this life of emerald gowns and feigned sorrow, Beatrice needed to control Eleanor's inheritance completely. And the easiest way to control it was to declare the true heir incompetent. A simple, unlettered girl who could not possibly understand complex finances. A lie her father, in his cautious wisdom, had inadvertently helped create. "Your mind is a treasure, Eleanor," he had told her, his voice warm in the firelight of his study. He had taught her not just to read and write, but to see the world in numbers, in patterns, in assets and debits. He had given her an education few men received. But it is a treasure that invites envy. Keep it hidden. Let them think you are ordinary. When the time is right, you will know when to show your strength. She had not known her father would die so suddenly. She had not known her stepmother's greed was a bottomless pit. Now, the secret he had urged her to keep for her protection had become the bars of her cage. To reveal her skills would be to defy her father's last instruction. To keep them hidden was to slowly suffocate under her stepmother's thumb. So she stood by the window, a ghost in her own life, counting the cost of the party that was paid for with her own stolen future. At the opposite end of the ballroom, leaning against a marble column, Duke Alistair Beaumont watched the spectacle with a deep, familiar weariness. His title required him to host these events, to move among the grasping, smiling members of the peerage. He was the most eligible bachelor in the county, the owner of 3 estates, the master of Beaumont Hall. And he had never felt more alone. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd. He saw Lord Ashworth laughing too loudly at a joke, his eyes calculating the proximity to a potential investor. He saw Lady Danbury appraising the jewels on another woman's neck with a flicker of envy. He saw fawning smiles, heard hollow laughter, and felt the suffocating weight of their collective ambition. They did not see him, Alistair. They saw a title, a vault, a stepping stone. His steward, Mr. Silas Croft, had organized the evening. Croft was a portly man with a perpetually damp brow who spoke in tones of unctuous loyalty. He had presented the plans for the ball with his usual efficiency. "A necessary display, Your Grace," he had explained, "to maintain the Beaumont name and influence." Alistair had approved it, but a nagging sense of unease had been growing in him for months. The estate's ledgers, all meticulously maintained by Croft, seemed perfect. Too perfect. Yet the returns from his investments felt sluggish. He felt a drain on his resources he could not pinpoint, a leak he could not find. He trusted no one enough to voice his suspicions. His gaze drifted, tired of the pretense, and settled on the quiet corner by the windows. He saw a young woman standing apart from the glittering throng. Lady Eleanor Vance. He knew who she was. Her stepmother, the Baroness, made sure everyone knew. He had heard the whispers, the carefully crafted tale of the simpleton stepdaughter. He watched her now, expecting to see the dull, placid expression of the girl Beatrice described. He saw something else entirely. She was not staring blankly. Her posture was still, but her eyes, even from this distance, were alive. They moved with a quiet intensity, scanning, observing, assessing. There was a focus in her gaze that was utterly at odds with the story of a girl who could not comprehend the world around her. Just then, the Baroness's voice, artificially pitched to Carrie, reached him across the floor. "A sweet child, but empty-headed. It is a cross I must bear." Alistair looked from Beatrice's dramatic, self-pitying face back to Eleanor. He saw the girl's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, the only sign she had heard. She did not look away from the window. She did not cry. She simply stood there, a small, unmoving island of stillness in a sea of noise. The contrast was jarring. The Baroness was loud, emotional, and public in her grief. Her stepdaughter was silent, contained, and private in her composure. He had seen true simple-mindedness before. It was vacant, unfocused. It was not this. This was something else. This was a person hiding, or being hidden. For the first time all evening, a spark of genuine interest cut through Alistair's boredom. He was a man who dealt in facts and evidence, and the evidence before him did not align. The Baroness's words were a performance. The girl's silent dignity felt like a truth. He was a good judge of character, a skill honed by years of deflecting sycophants and flatterers, and his judgment told him that Lady Eleanor Vance was far from simple. He pushed himself away from the column. The decision was sudden, an impulse born of curiosity and a deep-seated contempt for the petty cruelties of his class. The small crowd around him parted respectfully as he began to walk, his stride measured and deliberate. He ignored the hopeful glances of unmarried daughters and the speculative looks of their mothers. His eyes were fixed on the slender figure in the gray dress, a figure who seemed to hold a quiet mystery in a room full of loud, obvious people. Eleanor heard the subtle shift in the room before she saw it. The ambient chatter near her quieted. The rhythm of the music seemed to hold its breath. She felt a presence approaching, a focus of energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Slowly she turned from the window. Duke Alistair Beaumont was walking directly toward her. He was tall and imposing, his dark hair and serious face a stark contrast to the powdered and preening men around him. He moved with an innate authority that needed no announcement. The sea of guests rippled in his wake, their conversations faltering as they watched their host cross the entire length of his ballroom. His destination was clear. Her. Her heart gave a painful thud against her ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. This was wrong. This was dangerous. People like the Duke did not speak to people like her, the silent, invisible girl. His attention was a spotlight, and a spotlight was the last thing she could afford. It would only invite her stepmother's wrath later, in the suffocating privacy of their rooms. She wanted to flee, to melt back into the shadows of the curtains. But she was trapped. Her feet felt rooted to the polished marble. All she could do was stand and watch him come closer. His face was unreadable, his blue eyes intense. He was not smiling. He looked like a man on a mission, a man who had seen something that required investigation. He stopped a few feet from her. The silence in their small corner of the room was absolute, a pocket of stillness in the swirling party. He was about to speak. He was about to shatter the fragile, miserable peace of her anonymity. The sound of his footsteps was almost lost in the grand ballroom's hum. But for Eleanor, each one landed like a stone, dropping into a still pond. He was coming closer. She could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It was a quiet parting of the sea of silk and velvet. Duke Alistair Beaumont moved with an unhurried purpose that drew every eye. Yet his gaze was fixed only on the shadowed alcove where she stood. A single step, then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She willed herself to become part of the damask curtains, to simply dissolve into the shadows. This was impossible. Dukes did not cross crowded ballrooms to speak to forgotten stepdaughters. They did not seek out the girl everyone whispered was simple, the girl her own stepmother painted as a lovely, empty vessel. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the cool stone of the window ledge. The Duke's face was serious, his blue eyes sharp with an unnerving intelligence. She had seen that look before, when he surveyed his lands or listened to a petitioner. It was a look that measured, that weighed, that sought the truth beneath the surface. And now it was directed at her. A terrifying, thrilling thought flickered in her mind. He sees. Somehow he sees through the lie. Before he could reach her, a rustle of expensive silk cut through the air. Baroness Beatrice Vance appeared at his side as if summoned from thin air. Her smile was a masterpiece of social grace, wan and dazzling. It did not touch the cold calculation in her eyes. "Your Grace," she purred, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "You are far too kind to notice my shy little Eleanor. She hides in the corners, poor thing." Beatrice placed a proprietary hand on Alistair's arm, subtly steering him. Her movement was fluid, but it was a blockade. A beautiful, smiling wall between the Duke and her stepdaughter. Alistair's eyes did not leave Eleanor's. He gave the Baroness a slight, formal nod. "A quiet nature can be a sign of a thoughtful mind, Baroness." His voice was low and even, yet it held a distinct chill that cut through Beatrice's sweet tone. The Baroness's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. She had not expected a rebuttal, however polite. She recovered instantly, her laughter like the tinkling of delicate glass. "Oh, you are a philosopher, Your Grace. How charming." She turned her gaze to Eleanor, and all the warmth vanished from her expression, replaced by a predatory gleam. "But my Eleanor's thoughts are simple ones. Is that not right, dear?" Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. She knew this tone. This was the voice her stepmother used just before the cruelty began. She gave a tiny, numb nod, unable to form words. The Duke was still watching. His unwavering attention gave her a sliver of courage, but it also made her a target. Beatrice saw his interest not as a potential salvation for Eleanor, but as a threat to her own narrative. She had to extinguish it. She had to prove once and for all that her stepdaughter was exactly as useless as she claimed. In fact, Beatrice continued, her voice rising with false excitement, I was just given the most beautiful gift, a new book of poetry by Thomas Ansdell. She gestured to a nearby table where a slim volume lay. It was bound in pale blue leather, its title stamped in delicate gold leaf. A few guests, drawn in by the drama, began to drift closer. A small circle was forming. Eleanor felt the air grow thin, the walls of the ballroom closing in. She recognized the book. It was filled with simple, romantic verses, the kind taught to young ladies in their first year of lessons. It was a perfect, simple test. A perfect, cruel trap. Beatrice picked up the book, her movements theatrical. There is the most lovely dedication inside. My Eleanor, be a dear. Read it for the Duke. His Grace is a great patron of the arts, you know. She held the book out. It was not a request. It was a command, delivered on a public stage. The murmur of conversation around them died completely. Every eye in the vicinity was now on Eleanor, on the plain, quiet girl in the corner, on the book held out to her like a death sentence. Eleanor stared at the open page. The black ink of the dedication swam before her eyes. The words were simple, clear, and utterly legible. She could read them as easily as she could breathe. She could not only read them, she could analyze the meter, critique the sentiment, and estimate the printing cost of the entire volume down to the shilling. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, a desperate, loving whisper from years ago. Never show them, Eleanor. Not until you are safe. Our knowledge is a weapon. Do not hand it to your enemies until you are ready to strike. Her stepmother was her enemy, and Eleanor was not safe. She was cornered, exposed, and utterly powerless. To read the words would be to defy her father's dying wish. It would be to reveal the one secret she had guarded through years of misery and abuse. Beatrice would not be impressed. She would be furious. Her lie would be exposed, and her rage would be boundless. The punishments that would follow, back in the cold silence of their townhouse, would be unbearable. But to refuse, was to confirm the lie in front of the one person who seemed to doubt it. To see that flicker of interest in the Duke's eyes extinguished and replaced with the same pity or contempt as everyone else. Her throat was tight. Her face was a pale, frozen mask. She could feel the heat of a blush creeping up her neck, a hot tide of humiliation. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Beatrice's smile was now one of pure triumph. She had her. Either way, Eleanor lost. Eleanor looked from the book to her stepmother's smug face, then to the Duke. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were narrowed, watching the scene unfold with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like an assessment. He was not just watching her, he was watching Beatrice. Eleanor took a small, shaky breath. She could not read, but she would not be broken. She lowered her gaze from the Duke's, focusing on the book as if it were a confounding puzzle. My lady, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried in the profound quiet. The letters are very beautiful. The ink is so very black. She paused, choosing her next words with the care of a strategist moving pieces on a board. I would not want to spoil such fine words with my clumsy tongue. It is a gift for a learned man like the Duke, not for someone as simple as me. It was the perfect answer. It was humble. It was self-deprecating. It was exactly what everyone expected to hear from the unlettered girl. A wave of soft murmurs rippled through the onlookers. There were sighs of pity, knowing glances exchanged between ladies. One woman whispered to her companion, Poor thing, she truly cannot read a single word. The sound reached Eleanor, a sharp physical blow. Beatrice's victory was complete. She patted Eleanor's arm with condescending affection. There, child. It is quite all right. We love you just the way you are. She turned back to the Duke, her smile now radiating magnanimity. You see, Your Grace? A heart of gold, but a mind like a clean slate. Alistair looked at Beatrice. He said nothing. His face was a stone mask, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. He then looked at Eleanor, and for a split second their eyes met again. In her gaze he saw not the blankness of a simpleton, but a deep, shimmering ocean of pain and a flicker of something else. A defiant spark, quickly doused. He saw the intelligence in her choice of words. She had not said, "I cannot read." She had said she would not spoil the words. It was a subtle, clever distinction, one that everyone else had missed, but he had not. The shame was too much. The pitying stares, her stepmother's triumphant cruelty, the loss of that fragile, nascent hope. It was a weight she could no longer bear. Eleanor curtsied, a jerky, mechanical movement. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace." "Baroness, I feel unwell." She did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. She moved through the crowd of silks and jewels, an invisible ghost. Each step was an agony of restraint. She could feel their eyes on her back, their whispers following her like a cloud of stinging insects. She pushed open the heavy oak doors that led to the terrace and stepped out into the cool night air. The sudden chill was a shock, a welcome slap that broke the spell of the ballroom. She kept walking, her simple slippers soundless on the flagstones, moving down the steps and into the dark, manicured gardens. The music and laughter from the party faded behind her, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant, soothing sound of a fountain. She found a cold stone bench and hidden away in an alcove of sculpted hedges, and only then did she allow herself to crumble. The first sob was torn from her, a ragged, dalent gasp. Then another. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, hot and bitter. They streamed down her face, a release of years of pent-up frustration and grief. She wept for her father, who had given her the gift of a brilliant mind, but had left her in a world that would punish her for it. She wept for her own cowardice, for the lies she was forced to perpetuate day after day. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking in the darkness. The scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air, a sweet perfume that seemed to mock her sorrow. She was so utterly, desperately alone. High above, on a stone balcony overlooking the gardens, Duke Alistair Beaumont stood in the shadows. He had watched her flight, his own exit from the ballroom, just as swift and silent. He held an untouched glass of wine, his knuckles white around the stem. He had seen the entire sordid performance. He saw the Baroness's calculated cruelty, the way she had engineered the humiliation with the precision of a master torturer. He saw the sycophantic guests, so quick to believe the worst, to feed on a moment of weakness. And he saw Eleanor. He saw her trapped, her back against the wall, and the flicker of a razor-sharp mind in her carefully chosen deflective words. He looked down into the darkness where she had disappeared. He could not see her, but he could feel her sorrow hanging in the air. The whispers in the ballroom had declared her an imbecile. But what he had witnessed was not the confusion of a simpleton. It was the desperate gambit of a prisoner. The lie was not Eleanor's. The lie was the Baroness. The performance he had just witnessed was not for his benefit. It was a warning. It was a display of power, a demonstration of just how completely Beatrice Vance controlled her stepdaughter. His jaw was tight with a cold, rising anger. The financial irregularities on his estate were a puzzle he intended to solve. But now a new, more compelling mystery had presented itself. His suspicion, once a vague and formless thing, began to sharpen. It began to take a name, and it began to focus on the weeping girl in his garden. The cold night air clung to Eleanor's skin, a damp shroud over the burning shame that still heated her cheeks. In the manicured gardens of Beaumont Hall, the music from the ballroom was a distant, mocking echo. Each note seemed to carry the whispers and the thinly veiled laughter that had followed her from the room. She had stood there, a statue of humiliation, while her stepmother performed her favorite act. The caring guardian burdened with a simpleton stepdaughter. The lie was a cage she had lived in for years, but tonight, under the Duke's piercing gaze, the bars had felt sharper, more suffocating than ever before. Her father's final desperate instruction had been a shield. Protect your mind, Eleanor. Let them think you are a fool. It is the only way to survive her. But survival felt a lot like dying slowly. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin fabric of her gown offering no real warmth. The sculpted hedges and perfect flower beds felt like another part of the performance, too orderly for the chaos churning inside her. She needed to disappear, not just from the garden, but from the eyes she felt watching her. even in the dark. She could feel Duke Alistair Beaumont's scrutiny like a physical weight. He had watched the entire cruel spectacle. His expression had been unreadable, a mask of aristocratic indifference, yet she sensed something else beneath it. A flicker of, what, annoyance? Pity? She could not bear his pity. It was worse than the scorn. Retreating from the moonlight, she slipped back towards the house through a side entrance used by the staff. The corridor was cool and quiet, smelling of beeswax and dried herbs. Her soft-soled shoes made almost no sound on the polished stone flags. She walked past portraits of long-dead Beaumonts, their painted eyes following her with silent judgment. She was a ghost in this house, a footnote in her own life story, rewritten by a vindictive author. Her one desire was to find a place where no one would look for her, a corner dark enough to hide the tremor in her hands and the tears she refused to let fall. The library. The thought came to her as a whisper of salvation. It was Wicke's, little used during evening parties, and filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. It was a place of knowledge, a world she was forbidden from openly enjoying, which made its solitude all the more potent. She pushed open one of the towering oak doors. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a cavern of shadows. Moonlight streamed through the tall arched windows, painting silver rectangles on the floor and glinting off the spines of thousands of books. The air was still and cool, a welcome balm on her feverish skin. Eleanor moved silently between the towering shelves, her fingers lightly tracing the worn leather bindings. Here, surrounded by thoughts and histories and calculations, she felt a sliver of peace. This was her father's world. He would have loved this room. He had taught her to see the universe not just in poetry, but in the elegant, unyielding logic of numbers. He had shown her how to read a balance sheet like a story, to find the truth hidden in columns of figures. This knowledge was her only real inheritance, a treasure her stepmother could never find and could never steal, so long as Eleanor kept it buried. She stopped in the farthest, darkest corner of the room, a space between shelves dedicated to cartography and global trade. The shadows here were deep, almost absolute. She could finally let her shoulders slump. The mask of placid emptiness she wore in public could fall away. She leaned her forehead against the cool, rough wood of a bookshelf, closing her eyes. The humiliation of the evening washed over her again. Beatrice's sweet, poisonous voice asking her to read from the book. The expectant faces of the guests. The Duke's unwavering stare. She had answered as she always did, with a quiet, deflective phrase that confirmed their lowest expectations. It was a practiced, painful performance. But tonight it had felt different. Tonight, she had desperately wanted to shatter the lie, to take the book and read it with perfect clarity, to prove them all wrong. A sound from the doorway made her freeze. Her entire body went rigid. The heavy oak door had not been closed completely, and now it swung open further, followed by the sound of a man's confident, unhurried footsteps on the wooden floor. She held her breath, trying to melt into the shadows, praying it was a servant who would not notice her. But the footsteps were too heavy, too measured. They were the steps of someone who owned the very floorboards he walked upon. They stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound had been. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She kept her face turned to the books, her back to the room, hoping she was invisible. The acoustics in the main hall can be overwhelming. The voice was low, calm, and unmistakably Duke Alistair Beaumont's. It was not accusatory or mocking. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. Eleanor did not move. She did not breathe. Perhaps if she stayed perfectly still, he would assume he was mistaken and leave. He was the host. He had duties, guests to entertain. He had no reason to be here, in the darkest corner of his own library. I find, he continued, his voice slightly closer now, that the scent of old books is an effective antidote to the cloying perfume of false compliments. She could feel his presence behind her now, a tangible warmth in the cool air. He was not leaving. He had known she was here. He had sought her out. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her composure. What did he want? To question her? To send her back to her stepmother's side? Slowly forcing her limbs to obey, she turned. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on a point on the floor several feet in front of him. She could see the polished tips of his black leather shoes. She gave a slight deferential curtsy, a gesture of submission she had perfected over years of abuse. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She hoped it sounded timid and unremarkable. He did not respond to the formality. Instead, there was another stretch of silence. She could feel him studying her, his gaze as intense as it had been in the ballroom. She risked a fleeting glance upward. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his tall frame cutting a formidable silhouette against the moonlight from the windows. His face was in shadow, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw and the intelligence in his eyes. There was no pity there. There was only a quiet, unnerving curiosity. "Your stepmother is quite vocal about your education," he said. The word hung in the air, freighted with meaning. He did not say lack of education. The choice was deliberate. It was a test. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails dug into her palms. "The Baroness is very attentive," she replied, her voice tight. It was the safest answer, a noncommittal platitude. "Is she?" the Duke said. It was not a question. A log shifted in the distant fireplace at the other end of the library, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The soft crackle was the only sound. Alistair took a step closer, and Eleanor had to fight the instinct to flinch backward. He stopped beside her, not looking at her, but at the books on the shelf she had been facing. East India Company shipping manifests. Dry reading for most, he observed, his voice still measured and calm. Fortunes won and lost on the timeliness of a single vessel, on the price of tea in London versus the price of cotton in Calcutta. Eleanor remained silent. Her mind, however, was racing. She knew these books. She had read similar ledgers her father had kept. She understood the complex dance of risk, logistics, and market speculation they represented. It was a language she was fluent in, but one she could never speak. The Duke finally turned his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers in the dim light. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone shifting from conversational to something sharper, more focused. "The recent instability in the Caribbean sugar trade. The speculators in London are panicking. They say the crop failures in Jamaica will cause prices to double by spring. My own advisors concur. They urge me to invest heavily now before the price climbs." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was not small talk. This was a direct, technical question, a question no one would ever ask a simple, unlettered girl. Her mind, freed for a fraction of a second from its cage of fear, reacted instinctively. The problem was a familiar equation, one she had run through her head just last week after overhearing a conversation between two merchants. "They are wrong," she said. The words left her lips before she could stop them. Her voice was not a whisper. It was clear and firm, the voice of a person who deals in certainty. The Duke's expression did not change, but a new stillness came over him. He was listening, intently. The dam of her silence had been breached. For a moment, the thrill of intellectual freedom overpowered her fear. "The crop failure in Jamaica is real," she continued, her mind moving with a speed and clarity that felt intoxicating. "But the speculators are only looking at one part of the equation. They are not accounting for the new Portuguese shipping routes from Brazil. Their harvest was unexpectedly large. The first shipments have already been dispatched, but news travels slower than the ships. They will arrive in London docks within 6 weeks, creating a surplus, not a deficit. The price will not double. It will collapse." She laid out the logic with the clean, cold precision her father had taught her. She spoke of tonnage, of spoilage rates, of insurance premiums, and the commodity futures market. It was a cascade of information, a flawless analysis delivered in less than a minute. And then, as suddenly as it began, she stopped. The silence that rushed back in was horrifying. She stared at the Duke, her eyes wide with terror. What had she done? She had spoken. She had revealed herself. The years of careful concealment, of practiced ignorance, were shattered in a few reckless sentences. The thrill vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Her carefully constructed defense was gone. She was exposed. She looked at Duke Alistair Beaumont and saw not a potential ally, but the man who now held her secret. He could destroy her with a single word. He could mention it to her stepmother. The consequences would be unimaginable. Beatrice's cruelty was always sharpest when she felt her control was threatened. Eleanor's face paled. She felt faint. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she stammered, her voice reverting to a frightened whisper. I, I should not have spoken. I know nothing of these matters. I heard some merchants talking. I am just repeating gossip. Please pay it no mind." She was babbling, trying desperately to put the truth back in its box, to undo what could not be undone. She clasped her trembling hands in front of her head bowed in a posture of complete subservience. She looked once more like the girl everyone believed her to be, but the Duke was not looking at the cowering girl. He was looking at the woman who had, for a brief moment, stood before him, the woman with the brilliant, analytical mind. He watched the internal war playing out on her face, the intelligence warring with a deep, ingrained fear. He had asked a question, expecting a flicker of light in the darkness. She had answered with a bolt of lightning. He did not smile. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not press her further. He simply held her gaze for a long moment. In his eyes, there was no surprise, no anger, and certainly no pity. There was only a quiet, profound glint of understanding. It was a look that said, "I see you." Without another word, Alistair gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of confirmation. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps once again steady and measured as they receded across the vast, silent room. The library door clicked softly shut, leaving Eleanor utterly alone. She stood frozen among the tall shelves of books, her entire body trembling. The air was thick with the scent of leather and dust, but all she could feel was the frantic, wild hammering of her own heart against her ribs. He knew. The Duke of Beaumont knew her secret, and she had no idea what he would do with it. The silence in the carriage was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Outside, the lights of the city blurred into streaks of gold against the rain-slicked windows. Inside, there was only darkness and the cold fury radiating from Baroness Beatrice Vance. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the shifting patterns of the night. She could feel her stepmother's eyes on her, a physical weight in the gloom. The rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves on the cobblestones and the creak of the leather suspension were the only sounds. They were a drumbeat counting down to a confrontation she knew was inevitable. In her mind, she was still in the Duke's library. She could feel the rough texture of a book's spine under her fingertips, smell the scent of old paper and leather. She could see the glint of understanding in Duke Alistair Beaumont's eyes. It was a look she had not seen directed at her since her father passed away. For a fleeting moment, someone had looked at her and not seen a simpleton. He had seen a mind. The memory was a spark of warmth in the cold dread that now filled her. It was a dangerous warmth, a flicker of hope that her stepmother was determined to extinguish. Eleanor pressed her lips together. The hope was terrifying. It made the reality of her life, the one she was returning to, feel impossibly sharp and painful. When the carriage finally rolled to a stop before their townhouse, the silence had stretched into a thin, brittle wire. The footman opened the door, and the damp night air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet stone and coal smoke. Beatrice descended without a word, her silk gown rustling with irritation. Eleanor followed, a shadow in her plain wool dress, her head bowed. The house was quiet. The few servants who were still awake moved with a hushed caution, their eyes averted. They knew the Baroness's moods. They could feel the storm gathering. Beatrice swept past them, pulling off her gloves as she ascended the main staircase. "To my sitting room, Eleanor," she said, her voice low and tight. It was not a request. Eleanor's heart, which had just begun to settle, started to pound again, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She followed her stepmother up the carpeted stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air in the house was stale, a stark contrast to the clean, rain-washed air of Beaumont Hall. Here, everything felt confined, trapped. Beatrice's sitting room was a testament to her ambition. It was filled with gilded furniture, plush velvet chairs, and delicate porcelain figures that cost more than a farmer's yearly earnings. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered no warmth. Only a nervous, dancing light that made the shadows leap and twist. Beatrice did not sit. She stood in the center of the room, her back to the fire, her face a mask of controlled rage. Tell me, she began, her voice deceptively soft. Did you enjoy your little audience with the Duke? Eleanor kept her eyes on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. I was in the library, stepmother. He came in. He came in, Beatrice mimicked, her voice dripping with scorn. And you, of course, had nothing to say. You just stood there like a deaf mute, as you were raised to do. The question hung in the air, a baited hook. Eleanor remained silent. Any answer was the wrong answer. Admitting she had spoken would confirm Beatrice's fears. Lying would be pointless. Someone might have seen them. Her silence was the spark. Do not play the fool with me, Eleanor, Beatrice hissed, taking a step closer. I saw you. I saw him speaking to you. What did you say to him? What lies did you fill his head with? I said nothing of consequence, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Nothing of consequence. Beatrice laughed, a short, ugly sound devoid of humor. You think a man like Duke Beaumont speaks to a girl like you for no reason? You think your pathetic, wide-eyed silence is charming? She began to pace, her movements agitated like a caged animal. You have ambitions, don't you? After all these years of my charity, my patience, you think you can scheme your way into a duke's favor. You think you can whisper poisons in his ear about me. Eleanor flinched. No, I would never. You would and you did, Beatrice snapped, whirling to face her. Her eyes were cold and hard. You believe you are clever. You think because your father filled your head with useless figures and sums that you are better than your station. But I know what you are. You are a charity case, an unlettered, unmarriageable burden that I have graciously sheltered. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. Eleanor felt them land, piercing the fragile armor she had built around herself. She thought of her father, of the secret lessons in the dead of night, his gentle hands guiding hers as he taught her the elegant language of numbers. He had called her brilliant. He had told her to hide it, to protect it until the time was right. But the time never seemed to come. Now his praise was just another weapon for Beatrice to use against her. Look at you, Beatrice sneered, her gaze raking over Eleanor's simple gray gown. Standing there in your little mouse dress. Do you honestly believe a man of his stature would look twice at you? He was toying with you. Or worse, he was pitying you. The poor, simple stepdaughter of the Baroness Vance. My humiliation. A flicker of defiance stirred in Eleanor's chest. It was the echo of the Duke's respect, the memory of her own sharp answer about trade commodities. For an instant, she wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell this cruel, insecure woman that she could calculate the estate's entire yearly profit in her head, that she could balance accounts more complex than Beatrice could ever comprehend. But the defiance was smothered by a lifetime of fear. She pressed her lips together, forcing the words down. Revealing her secret now, here would be a catastrophe. Beatrice saw the shift in her expression, the flash of something that was not pure submission in her eyes. It enraged her. You have secrets, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have always had them. Little plots, foolish ideas you think I do not see. She moved past Eleanor, her purpose clear. We are going to have a lesson in gratitude, a lesson in knowing your place. Beatrice strode out of the sitting room and down the short hall to Eleanor's bedroom. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She followed, her feet feeling like lead. Her room was her only sanctuary. It was small, sparse, with a narrow bed, a plain wooden wardrobe, and a small writing desk. It held the few things in the world that were truly hers. Beatrice pushed the door open and surveyed the room with contempt. Pathetic, she muttered. She walked to the wardrobe and threw open the doors. She pulled out Eleanor's few dresses, simple garments of wool and cotton, and let them fall to the floor. Hardly the wardrobe of a social climber. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. This was a violation, an invasion of her last private space. She felt a wave of nausea. She watched as Beatrice moved to the desk, her manicured fingers rifling through the few papers there. A book of poetry from her father. A pressed flower. Beatrice scoffed and swept them aside. Then her eyes landed on the small, dark wood box on the nightstand. It was a simple thing, unadorned, but it was locked. What is in here? Beatrice demanded, picking it up. Eleanor's voice was a choked whisper. Nothing. Personal effects. Personal effects? Beatrice rattled the box. Something inside made a faint, metallic sound. You have nothing that is personal. Everything you have because of me. Open it. Eleanor shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. No. The word so quiet was like a thunderclap in the room. Beatrice stared at her, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was the first time Eleanor had ever directly refused her. A slow, venomous smile spread across Beatrice's face. No, she repeated softly. How brave we are, after a single conversation with a duke. She did not ask again. She carried the box back to her sitting room and placed it on a small table. With a vicious calm, she picked up a heavy, ornate letter opener from her desk. Eleanor watched in horror. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. Please, do not. Beatrice ignored her. She jammed the tip of the letter opener into the seam of the box and twisted. The wood groaned, then split with a sickening crack. The lid broke free, falling to the carpet. Beatrice tipped the contents of the box onto the velvet surface of a nearby ottoman. Lying there, nestled in the ruined remains of its velvet lining, was a small abacus. It was crafted from polished silver, no bigger than a man's palm, with tiny, delicate beads of ivory. It shone in the firelight, a thing of intricate beauty and quiet purpose. Beatrice stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. What is this childish thing, a toy? The fight went out of Eleanor. A profound, aching emptiness opened up inside her. It was my father's, she said, her voice hollow. He gave it to me. At the mention of her father, Beatrice's expression hardened. She finally understood. This was not just a trinket. This was a symbol, a legacy. She picked up the abacus, her fingers clumsy against its delicate frame. Ah, yes, your brilliant father, she said with a cruel twist of her lips. The man who was so clever with numbers but so foolish with his life. He should have spent less time teaching you silly games and more time securing your future. She held it up, letting it catch the light. This is the root of your delusion. This little piece of silver. It makes you think you are special. It makes you forget what you are. Eleanor could only watch, her breath caught in her throat. That abacus was everything. It was the quiet evenings with her father, his arm around her shoulder. It was the secret language they shared, the pride in his eyes when she solved a particularly difficult problem. It was the last tangible piece of his love, the final proof that she had once been cherished, that her mind was a gift, not a curse. With a flick of her wrist, Beatrice turned and walked to her own towering jewelry armoire. She opened a drawer overflowing with glittering necklaces and diamond earrings. Without a second glance, she tossed the small silver abacus inside. It landed with a soft, muffled clink, disappearing among the ostentatious baubles. It was swallowed by her stepmother's greed, lost in a sea of stolen wealth. The act was so casual, so dismissive. It was the final desecration. Beatrice closed the drawer and turned back to Eleanor, her face triumphant. There, she said, her voice cold and final. Now it is with things of actual value. Let this be a lesson to you, Eleanor. You have nothing. You are nothing without my permission. Do not ever forget that again. She swept from her sitting room, leaving the door to Eleanor's ravaged bedroom wide open. She did not look back. For a long time, Eleanor did not move. The house was silent again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of a tomb. Slowly, mechanically, she walked back to her room. The sight of her dresses on the floor, the papers scattered from her desk, the broken box on the floor, barely registered. Her gaze was fixed on the empty space on her nightstand. She knelt and picked up the two splintered halves of the wooden box. Her fingers traced the rough, broken edges. The velvet lining was torn. There was no sound, no great, shattering sob, just a single hot tear that escaped and fell onto the empty lining, making a small, dark spot. The tiny spark of hope the Duke had ignited in the library was gone. It had been snuffed out, buried under a mountain of cruelty and loss. The abacus was not just an object. It was her past. It was her identity. It was the quiet, constant reminder that she was her father's daughter. Without it, she felt adrift. The walls of her small room, once a sanctuary, now felt like the walls of a cell pressing in on her from all sides. She was utterly, completely alone, and more hopelessly trapped than she had ever been in her life. The hollowness in her chest had a weight to it. It had been days since her stepmother had taken the abacus, and the space where it used to be, tucked away in her sewing box, felt like a void. Eleanor sat in the carriage, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the worn fabric of her gloves a poor substitute for the cool silver and smooth ivory beads she was used to touching for comfort. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road to Beaumont Hall did nothing to soothe her. Each beat was a reminder of the passage of time, of a life she was not living, of a mind she was forced to keep locked away. Her father's last gift was gone. It was more than a keepsake. It was the key to a secret world only she and he had shared, a world of logic, of patterns, of beautiful, irrefutable truth. Now it sat in Beatrice's jewelry box, a trophy of her cruelty. The summons had been a shock. A liveried footman from Beaumont Hall had arrived with a note addressed to her stepmother, requesting Eleanor's presence. Beatrice had read the heavy cream paper, her lips thinning into a hard line. She had looked at Eleanor with a familiar, cold assessment. It was not a look of pride, but of suspicion, as if Eleanor were a tool that was suddenly behaving in an unexpected way. Her stepmother could not refuse the Duke, but she had made her displeasure clear. The entire journey was a silent punishment, with Beatrice's disapproval radiating from the opposite seat, more oppressive than any spoken word. Why had he summoned her? The question had circled endlessly in Eleanor's mind. After their brief, strange encounter in the library, she had expected nothing. She had hoped for nothing. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. They were shown into a small, formal sitting room to wait. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and dried flowers. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, studying the intricate pattern of the rug. She traced the woven vines with her gaze, calculating the repetitions, the breaks in the design, anything to keep her mind from the gnawing anxiety. What did he want? Had he summoned her simply to expose her again? To place her in another impossible situation for his own quiet amusement? The thought sent a chill through her. She remembered his eyes in the library, the unnerving perception in them. He was not a cruel man like her stepmother, but he was powerful. And powerful men were often careless with the lives of people they considered insignificant. After what felt like an eternity, the same footman appeared at the door. He bowed slightly. He announced that the Duke would see Lady Eleanor now. Alone. Beatrice's head snapped up, her expression a mask of controlled fury. She wanted to protest. Eleanor could see it in the tightening of her jaw, but she could not. She gave Eleanor a sharp, warning glance that promised retribution later, then composed her face into a pleasant mask as the footman waited. Eleanor stood, her legs feeling unsteady. She smoothed down the front of her simple gray dress, a nervous gesture she couldn't suppress. Following the footman down the long, quiet corridor, her own soft footsteps seemed impossibly loud against the polished wood floors. Portraits of Alistair's ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. The footman stopped before a pair of tall, dark oak doors and knocked once. A quiet, firm voice from within said, "Enter." The footman opened one of the doors and held it for her, then retreated, closing it behind her with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the room. Eleanor found herself standing in the Duke's private study. It was a formidable space lined from floor to ceiling with books. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and leather. A fire crackled in the large stone hearth, but it did little to dispel the room's shadows. Rain pattered softly against the tall windows, blurring the view of the gardens outside. Duke Alistair Beaumont sat behind a massive desk, a single lamp casting a pool of golden light over a scatter of papers. He was not alone. Standing beside the desk was a portly, florid man in his 50s, his posture a study in feigned deference. Alistair looked up as she entered. His expression was as unreadable as ever. "Lady Eleanor, thank you for coming." His voice was formal, measured. He gestured to a single, straight-backed chair placed several feet in front of his desk. It was an awkward, exposed position. She felt like a specimen under examination. "Please, have a seat." Eleanor moved to the chair and sat, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped once more in her lap. She murmured a quiet, "Your Grace," her voice barely a whisper. The man beside the desk gave her a brief, dismissive glance before turning his attention back to the Duke. "As I was saying, Your Grace," the man continued, his tone overly smooth, "the quarterly accounts for the household are all in order. Just a few final tallies requiring your signature." He indicated a large open ledger on the desk. This must be the steward, Eleanor thought. Mr. Croft. She had heard her stepmother mention him once, describing him as an exceptionally loyal and efficient man. Alistair did not look at the ledger. He was watching Eleanor. "Mr. Croft," the Duke said, his voice deceptively mild, "this is Lady Eleanor Vance. I have asked her here to observe." Silas Croft turned to her fully this time. A faint, condescending smile touched his lips. He gave a small, oily bow. "A pleasure, my lady." His eyes flickered over her plain dress with an air of superiority. He clearly saw what everyone else saw, a simple, unimportant girl. He then looked back at the Duke, a hint of confusion in his expression. "Observe, Your Grace." Alistair picked up a pen, tapping it lightly on the desk. The small sound was sharp in the quiet room. "Indeed, I believe a fresh perspective can be illuminating, even in matters of simple arithmetic." He said the last words while looking directly at Croft, but Eleanor felt the comment was somehow aimed at her. It was a barb, a reference to her supposed ignorance, and she felt a familiar sting of humiliation. Croft chuckled, a low, sycophantic sound. "Of course, Your Grace. Very wise. Though I assure you these sums are quite straightforward. Nothing that would trouble a great mind like your own for more than a moment." He gestured to a line of figures with a plump finger. "The expenses for the stables, the kitchens, the staff wages, all accounted for." He spoke as if explaining something to a child. The condescension in his voice was thick. He was performing for the Duke, showing off his diligence and control. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on a point on the floor just beyond the desk. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. This was a new kind of torture. She was being made to sit and witness a display of the very skills she was forced to pretend she did not possess. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. "A moment, Mr. Croft," the Duke said suddenly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The expenditure for grain shipment from the north, it seems higher than last quarter." His question was a stone dropped into the smooth pond of Croft's presentation. The steward did not falter. He leaned forward immediately, flipping back a few pages in the ledger. "Ah, an astute observation, Your Grace. Entirely due to the early rains this season. It affected the supply routes. We had to engage a different shipping merchant, a slightly more expensive but more reliable one. It is all documented." He turned the ledger around for the Duke to see, pointing to a specific entry. As he did so, the book was angled perfectly, if briefly, toward Eleanor. The page was upside down from her perspective, but her mind, starved for stimulus, latched onto it instantly. Her father had taught her to read ledgers from any angle. It was a game they used to play. He would slide the account books across the table, quizzing her on the upside-down columns of figures. It trained the mind, he'd said, to see the pattern, not just the symbol. For a split second, her eyes scanned the page Croft was indicating. It was a blur of ink and paper, but to Eleanor it was as clear as day. Her gaze swept past the entry for the grain shipment and fell onto the column of summary totals at the bottom of the page. Numbers flowed into her mind, not as individual digits, but as whole concepts. She saw the listed expenses, the subtotals, and the final sum. And in that single fleeting moment, something screamed at her. A single jarring note in an otherwise harmonious piece of music. It was wrong. The final total was wrong. It was not a small error, the kind made by a tired clerk transposing two numbers. It was a clean, significant figure. The sum was off by exactly 500 pounds. Her mind worked faster than she could breathe. She did the addition in her head, the column of numbers stacking up with perfect clarity. 842, 1,210, 605, 730. The actual total was 3,387. The number written in the ledger was 3,887. It was a clean, deliberate inflation. The kind of error no one would notice unless they re-added the entire column themselves. And who would bother to re-add a steward's simple arithmetic? A jolt went through her, sharp and electric. It was a feeling she had not experienced in years. It was the thrill of the puzzle, the sharp, beautiful click of a lock tumbling open. It was the voice of her father in her ear, praising her for her quickness. For a fraction of a second, the timid, frightened girl in the chair vanished. In her place was the brilliant mind her father had so carefully nurtured. The mask slipped. All the pain of the last few days, the grief over her lost abacus, the humiliation of her stepmother's cruelty, it all receded, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated focus. The world narrowed to that single fraudulent number on the page. Croft, satisfied with his own explanation, turned the ledger back towards himself. As you can see, Your Grace, perfectly logical. He straightened up, his face smug. He was so confident, so certain of his own cleverness and of everyone else's lack of attention. He glanced at Eleanor again, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He saw her sitting there, silent and still, and assumed she was simply bored or confused, a doll propped in a chair. He had no idea that the doll had just seen the fatal flaw in his perfect little world. The deception was so simple, yet so effective. A small, untraceable amount skimmed from the top, hidden in plain sight within a column of legitimate expenses. How many other pages held such clean, round errors? Eleanor felt a sudden, terrifying impulse to speak. The truth was a physical thing, lodged in her throat, desperate to be released. But years of conditioning, of fear, held it back. To speak would be to reveal everything, to defy her stepmother, to shatter the lies she had been forced to live for so long. The consequences would be immediate and severe. Beatrice would ruin her, and what proof did she have? A fleeting glance at an upside-down page? Who would believe her, the simple, unlettered girl, over the Duke's trusted steward of 15 years? Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She forced herself to breathe, to push the truth back down. She lowered her head, her hair falling forward to hide her face, hoping neither man had seen the change in her expression. But she was too late. As she lifted her head, her gaze involuntarily flickered up and met the Duke's. It was only for a second, a bare sliver of time. But in that second, the connection was absolute. He had not been looking at Croft or the ledger. He had been watching her, and he had seen it. He had seen the flicker, the sudden sharp light in her eyes, the momentary shift from vacant compliance to piercing intelligence. He saw the truth she was so desperately trying to hide. There was no surprise in his expression. Only a quiet, intense confirmation, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, as if he had orchestrated the entire scene just to see if his hunch was correct. A wave of panic washed over her. She broke eye contact immediately, her gaze dropping back to the floor. Her face burned with heat. She was exposed. He knew. He might not know what she had seen, but he knew that she had seen something. He knew the simpleton act was a lie. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and fraught with unspoken meaning. Croft seemed oblivious, waiting patiently for the Duke's approval. But the dynamic in the room had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. It was no longer a simple meeting between a Duke and his steward. It had become a silent, dangerous triangle of knowledge, suspicion, and discovery. Alistair picked up his pen again. He did not sign the page. He simply stared down at it, his face a mask of thoughtful concentration. But Eleanor knew he was not looking at the numbers. He was replaying that single shared glance in his mind. He was weighing what he had seen against what he had been told. The quiet girl who could not read had just shown more insight in a single, unguarded look than his trusted steward had in an entire presentation. Mr. Croft cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound that betrayed his first hint of unease at the Duke's prolonged silence. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Your Grace?" he asked, his smooth confidence finally beginning to fray at the edges. Duke Alistair did not answer him immediately. He slowly closed the ledger. The sound was soft, but it landed with the finality of a gavel. He then looked at Eleanor, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was comfortable. There was no accusation in his gaze, but there was a new and unsettling weight to it. It was a look of evaluation, of possibility. Finally, he turned his attention to his steward. That will be all for today, Mr. Croft. Leave the ledger with me. I wish to review it further. The dismissal was polite but firm. It was not a request. Silas Croft's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He had expected a signature, not a review. He bowed stiffly. As you wish, Your Grace. He cast one last, uncertain glance at Eleanor before turning and walking out of the study, the door closing softly behind him. Eleanor was now alone with the Duke. The silence he left behind was more charged than before. The fire crackled. The rain continued its soft rhythm against the glass. Eleanor's hands were trembling in her lap. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, afraid of what she would see if she looked up. She had seen the lie, and the Duke knew she had seen it. Her carefully constructed world of silent obedience had just been fractured. She waited for him to speak, for the accusation, for the demand. But he said nothing. He simply sat behind his great desk, the source of all the power in the room, and watched her. Her eyes met the Duke's for a split second, and he saw a flicker of sharp intelligence before she looked away. But he knew she saw something. The day had bled into a cold, restless evening. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed in the small guest room, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. The room was quiet, but her mind was a storm of noise. She kept seeing it. That moment. The split second when her eyes had met the Duke's across the steward's shoulder. It was a look that had lasted no longer than a single heartbeat, yet it had stretched into an eternity. In his gaze, she had not seen the polite disinterest or veiled pity she was accustomed to. She had seen a flicker of sharp, assessing curiosity. He had seen something in her. He had seen the lie she had so carefully cultivated for years. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Her stepmother's voice was a venomous whisper in her memory, a constant reminder of the consequences of being seen. A simpleton was safe. A clever girl was a threat. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, trying to force the image away. It was foolish. She was imagining it. He was a duke. She was a nobody, a ghost haunting the edges of society rooms. He had likely forgotten her the moment she looked away. She had to believe that. To hope for anything more was a dangerous, self-destructive fantasy. The feeling of helplessness was a familiar weight, settling back over her like a heavy shroud. It was the same feeling she had when her stepmother had taken her father's abacus. The cold, final theft of her last connection to him, to the person she truly was. She was trapped, and this brief, imagined connection was just another bar on her cage. A sharp, decisive knock on her door shattered the silence. Eleanor flinched, her head snapping up. It was late. Her stepmother was still downstairs, likely charming some wealthy baron and securing her own future. No one ever came to Eleanor's room. She stood slowly, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed down the simple gray fabric of her gown, a useless gesture of composure, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she turned the brass knob. A young footman stood in the corridor, his face impassive. He was dressed in the Beaumont livery, his posture ramrod straight. He did not look at her with contempt or pity, but with a neutral professionalism that was somehow more unnerving. He simply looked through her. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice a low monotone. "His Grace, the Duke, requests your presence in his private study." The words hung in the air between them, each one a stone dropping into a deep, silent well. The Duke's study. At this hour. It was not a request. It was a summons. Every fear she had tried to suppress moments before came rushing back, a suffocating tide. He had seen. He knew. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She would be exposed, humiliated, and cast out. Her stepmother's victory would be absolute. Now. The word was a faint breath, barely audible. "Immediately, my lady," the footman replied, his expression unchanged. He made a small gesture down the long, shadowed hallway. "If you would please follow me." Eleanor could not feel her feet as she stepped out of her room. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her away from the only small, private space she had in this vast, imposing house. The walk to the Duke's study felt like a procession to the gallows. Beaumont Hall was a different creature at night. The grand tapestries that lined the walls seemed to hold darker scenes, the woven figures twisting into menacing shapes in the flickering candlelight from the wall sconces. The eyes of the portraits of Alastair's ancestors seemed to follow her, their painted faces stern and judgmental. She could almost hear them whispering, "Who is this girl? What is she doing here?" Her own footsteps echoed too loudly on the polished marble floors, a lonely sound in the immense silence. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old stone. With every turn down another corridor, the knot of dread in her stomach tightened. She clutched her own arms, trying to hold herself together, trying to stop the trembling that had started in her hands and was now spreading through her entire body. The footman walked a few paces ahead, a silent, implacable guide leading her toward her fate. They finally reached a section of the house she had never seen, dominated by heavy, dark oak doors. The footman stopped before one pair, larger and more imposing than the rest. He did not knock. He simply reached out, turned the heavy brass handle, and pushed one of the doors inward. It opened with a deep, sonorous groan, revealing a cavern of darkness beyond. "Lady Eleanor," the footman announced into the void, then stepped acid, holding the door open for her. She hesitated for a single heart-stopping moment. Her body screamed at her to turn, to run, to flee back to the anonymity of her room. But she knew there was no escape. Whatever awaited her in that room, she had to face it. Taking a shallow, shaky breath, she forced her feet to move, crossing the threshold from the dimly lit corridor into almost complete blackness. The door closed behind her. The sound was a heavy, definitive thud, followed by the metallic click of the latch. The finality of it echoed in the sudden, profound silence. She was alone, or she thought she was. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. The room was enormous, far larger than she had imagined. The air was thick with the rich, comforting scent of leather, old paper, and the faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco. It was the scent of her father's study, a fragrance from a life she thought was lost forever. A vast fireplace stood cold and dark on one wall. The walls themselves were lined with books from floor to ceiling, their spines forming a mosaic of deep reds, greens, and browns in the shadows. And then she saw him. Across the vast expanse of the room, a single oil lamp burned on a massive oak desk. Its golden light cast a small, intimate circle, leaving the rest of the study in darkness. Duke Alistair Beaumont stood beside the desk, one hand resting on its polished surface. He was not a silhouette against the fire, but a solid, commanding presence illuminated by that single focused light. He was watching her, his face serious, his blue eyes sharp and unreadable in the warm glow. He did not speak as she stood frozen just inside the door. He simply waited, allowing the weight of the silence and the intimidating scale of the room to press down on her. Eleanor's heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She felt small, insignificant, an insect caught in a spider's web. She waited for the accusation, for the cold dismissal. Finally, she found the courage to take a step forward, then another, her simple shoes making no sound on the thick, dark rug that covered the floor. She stopped a respectful distance from the desk, her hands once again twisting the fabric of her dress. She kept her eyes lowered, fixed on the intricate patterns of the rug. She could not bear to meet his gaze again. "Lady Eleanor," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the vast space, a low, measured tone that held an undeniable authority. It was calm, precise, and held no trace of anger. That was somehow worse. She managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. He did not ask her to sit. He did not engage in any pleasantries. His focus was absolute. He moved his hand from the desk and lifted something from the shadows beside the lamp. He placed it squarely in the center of the pool of light. It was a book, a large account ledger bound in worn crimson leather. The cover was scuffed at the edges, the color faded from years of use. There was no title on the spine, no markings to indicate its purpose. It was anonymous, and yet it radiated an aura of immense importance. It lay on the desk between them, a silent challenge. Eleanor's eyes were drawn to it. She recognized the format, the size. It was a master ledger, the kind that contained not just daily expenses, but the secret heart of an entire estate's finances. A book of secrets. Alistair let her look at it for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face, watching every minute flicker of emotion. He was studying her as intently as she was studying the book. Then he spoke again, his voice still quiet, but now edged with a steel that cut through the silence. They say you cannot read, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact that had been presented to him. Your stepmother has made it quite clear to all of society. You are simple, unlettered, unable to even comprehend a line of poetry. Eleanor flinched as if he had struck her. The public humiliation at the ball, her flight to the gardens, it all came rushing back. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, bracing for the final blow. If that is true, the Duke continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense, then this is just a book, a collection of meaningless symbols on paper. It will mean nothing to you. He paused, letting the words sink in. He leaned forward slightly, his presence becoming even more concentrated, more powerful. The lamplight carved sharp lines onto his face, highlighting the firm set of his jaw and the piercing intelligence in his eyes. But if it is a lie, he said, and now his voice was barely more than a whisper, a deeply personal and resonant sound meant only for her. If for all these years you have been playing a part, if you have been hiding what you truly are, then this is your chance to prove it. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes flew from the ledger to his face, and for the first time, she saw past the powerful Duke. She saw a man weary of lies, a man surrounded by deceit, searching desperately for a single fixed point of truth. It was a gamble. He was gambling on her, a complete unknown. He was placing the trust he gave to no one else into her hands. The terror inside her was immense, a roaring inferno. But for the first time in years, another feeling rose to meet it, a tiny, fierce spark of exhilaration, a feeling of coming alive. Her father's lessons, the long nights spent by candlelight, learning the secret language of numbers, the complex art of finding truth hidden in a sea of figures, it all surged within her. This was the moment he had prepared her for, the moment to matter. The Duke's gaze held hers, demanding an answer she could not speak. He pushed the crimson ledger a few inches closer to her side of the desk. "Show me what you saw this afternoon," he commanded softly. "Show me the error in Mr. Croft's perfect accounts. Show me the truth." Eleanor stared at the book. It was a prison, or it was a key. It could be her final public ruin, or it could be the weapon that won her freedom. The choice was hers. All the years of silent suffering, of biting her tongue, of playing the fool to survive, had led to this single silent moment in a dark room with a man who was willing to believe a lie was a lie. Alistair watched her for one more second. He saw the war in her eyes, the fear battling with a fierce, dawning resolve. He had his answer, not in words, but in the way her hand, though trembling, unclenched at her side, in the way her chin lifted just a fraction of an inch. He had made his wager. Now it was up to her to play the hand. Without another word, he straightened up, his part in the scene finished. He gave the ledger one last look, then turned his back on her and the desk. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace toward the massive doors. His footsteps were heavy, decisive, echoing the pounding of Eleanor's own heart. He did not look back. He reached the doors, pulled one open, and stepped out into the corridor. He then pulled the heavy door shut behind him. The sound was immense, a deep boom that reverberated through the study, followed by the sharp, metallic click of the lock turning. The sound faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. Eleanor stood alone in the vast, dark room. The single lamp on the desk cast a lonely circle of light around her. In the center of that light, waiting for her, lay the crimson ledger. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and the sound seemed to absorb all the air in the room. Eleanor stood frozen in the sudden, profound silence. The only sounds left were the frantic beat of her own heart and the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. For a long moment, she did not move. She simply stared at the place where Duke Alistair Beaumont had been standing. He had left her. He had trusted her. The weight of that trust felt heavier than all her stepmother's years of cruelty. What if he was wrong? What if she failed? The thought sent a spike of ice through her veins. Failure meant more than just her own humiliation. It meant validating every lie Beatrice had ever told. It meant proving to the one man who had looked past the rumors that he had been a fool to do so. Her feet felt like lead, but she forced them to move. One step, then another, across the plush Aubusson carpet. The air in the study was cool and smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, clean scent of beeswax polish. Long shadows thrown by the single desk lamp danced against the towering shelves of books, making them look like silent, looming judges. The crimson ledger sat on the massive desk, a dark pool of red in the warm circle of light. It looked ordinary, unassuming, yet it held her entire future within its pages. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Her fingertips brushed against the worn leather cover, and the texture was surprisingly soft, smoothed by years of handling. It was heavier than she expected. She drew it closer, her breath catching in her throat. This was it, the precipice. With a final shuddering inhale, she opened the book. The first page was a dense forest of ink. There were no neat columns, no clear labels for income or expenses. It was a chaotic web of numbers, symbols, and abbreviated words that made no immediate sense. A wave of panic washed over her. It was a cipher, a private code known only to the Duke and his most trusted confidant. And she, a girl who was supposed to be unable to read her own name, was expected to break it. Her eyes scanned the page, desperate and uncomprehending. The numbers swam before her. Perhaps Beatrice was right. Perhaps she was a fool, reaching for something far beyond her grasp. Then she saw it. Tucked away in the top right corner of the page, next to a string of figures, was a small two-part symbol, a circle with a vertical line through its center, followed by a triangle pointing downwards. It was nothing to anyone else, a meaningless doodle. But to Eleanor, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Her heart stopped. She knew that symbol. Her father had used it. It was part of a complex accounting shorthand he had developed himself, a system he had called double-entry moral accounting. One symbol for the flow of coin, the other for the justification, the stated purpose. He had taught it to her on rainy afternoons in his study, a secret game between a father and his unusually gifted daughter. Numbers tell a story, Eleanor, he used to say, his voice a warm murmur. You just have to learn their language. Most people only read the words. You must learn to read the truth beneath them. The fear that had been strangling her for minutes, for years, suddenly vanished. It did not fade. It shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, electrifying exhilaration. Her father's legacy was not just the silver abacus her stepmother had stolen. It was this knowledge, this power. It was a part of her that no one could ever take away. A small, breathless laugh escaped her lips in the quiet room. She was not a victim in a cage. She was a master craftsman who had just been handed the finest, most intricate puzzle she had ever seen. She sank into the Duke's enormous leather chair. It was still warm from his presence. The high back cradled her, and for the first time she did not feel small in a large room. She felt perfectly placed. She pulled the heavy brass lamp closer, its light tightening around her in the ledger, pushing the rest of the world into darkness. On a small tray beside the inkwell were several sheets of thick, cream-colored paper bearing the Duke's watermark. Next to them lay a newly sharpened quill. Without a second thought, she took one. She dipped the quill into the ink, the small scratching sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. This was a transgression she would have never dared to imagine just hours ago. Using the Duke's private stationery, sitting in his personal chair. But she felt no fear, only a driving, urgent sense of purpose. Her mind, so long suppressed and starved of challenge, came roaring to life. The years of forced idleness, of pretending to be simple, fell away like a heavy cloak. The mental muscles her father had so carefully trained were stiff at first, then quickly found their old rhythm. The code was complex. Some entries were straightforward transactions, recorded with a two-part symbol. Others were intentionally obscured, using secondary symbols to denote transfers between different estate accounts, masking the true origin and destination of the funds. It was designed to be unreadable to a casual observer, yet perfectly clear to someone who knew the system. And Eleanor knew the system. She knew it as well as she knew her own name. She did not try to make sense of the ledger itself. That was a fool's errand. It was designed to confuse. Instead, she began to rebuild it. On the Duke's clean paper, she drew her own columns. Date, entry, debit, credit, source account, destination account, justification code. She started from the first page, from an entry dated nearly 2 years ago. Her fingers flew, her quill scratching rhythmically against the paper. She ignored the narrative notes and the messy scrawl, focusing only on the numbers and the symbols her father had taught her. She translated the cipher back into the universal language of accounting. The great clock in the main hall chimed midnight, its deep tones vibrating faintly through the floorboards. Eleanor did not hear it. Her world had shrunk to the pool of light on the desk, to the dialogue between the crimson book and her own pristine sheet of paper. The fire in the hearth slowly burned down to glowing embers, and the room grew colder, but she felt nothing. She was lost in the work, in the beautiful, cold logic of the numbers. An entry for stonework east wall caught her eye. The sum was significant, £500. She found the corresponding justification code, Malfound. It was simple, standard. But then, 3 weeks later, another entry, stonework east wall, £450. A month after that, another, £510. Her father had taught her that repairs were sporadic. A wall might need work after a bad storm, or once a decade from simple decay. It would not need constant, expensive attention month after month. She started a new section on her paper, titling it Anomalies. She listed the east wall payments. Then she kept digging. Deeper into the ledger, she found a series of payments for agricultural lime. The purchases were made every month, even in the dead of winter when the fields were frozen and nothing was being planted. The cost was exorbitant. Who bought lime in January? And in such quantities? She added it to her list. Her mind was a fine-toothed comb, sifting through the jumbled data. She cross-referenced payments to suppliers. A Mr. Thomas Green was paid handsomely for providing both hay for the stables and silks for the household draperies. A John Smith was listed as the supplier for everything from roofing lead to French brandy. It was possible, but highly improbable. Large estates dealt with specialized merchants, not a single man who could miraculously provide every conceivable good. The names were likely phantoms, inventions created to receive payments that went nowhere. Or rather, they went somewhere, but not to any legitimate supplier. Hours bled into one another. The quill felt like an extension of her own hand. The numbers were no longer just figures on a page. They were characters in a drama. She could see the flow of money as if it were water, moving through the estate's accounts. She saw where it was supposed to go and where it was being secretly diverted into small, hidden pools. The system was ingenious in its deception. Small amounts, just under the threshold that might trigger scrutiny, were siphoned off from dozens of different sources. A little from the timber sales, a little from tenant rents, a little from the household budget. Individually, they were almost unnoticeable, but together they formed a river. Her focus was absolute. This was more than an intellectual exercise. Every uncovered discrepancy was a strike against her stepmother's smug pronouncements. Every decoded entry was a reclamation of her own mind. With each line she wrote, she felt herself solidifying. The shy, silent girl who stood by the windows at balls was a ghost. The real Eleanor was here in this chair, with ink on her fingers and the cold, hard light of truth unfolding before her. She was her father's daughter, and she was magnificent. As the first hint of gray dawn began to soften the edges of the window frames, she found it. It was not a single entry, but a pattern so subtle and so consistent it could only be deliberate. There was a recurring payment made on the last day of every single month. The amount varied slightly, but it was always a large sum, between £200 and £300. The justification code was one her father had designed for discretionary expenses, personal. It was a slush fund of sorts that the head of an estate might use for gifts or unlogged travel. But these payments were not sporadic. They were as regular as a salary, and each payment was coded with a secondary symbol she had not seen before. It was a simple SC. The initials were obvious. Silas Croft, the Duke's loyal steward. That was the first layer, but there was another, almost invisible mark beside it, a tiny stylized B. Eleanor's hand froze above the paper. B. Beatrice. It could not be. It was too direct, too damning. She looked closer, her heart beginning to pound a new, heavier rhythm. But her father's code was precise. SC was the agent of the transaction. The tiny B was the designated beneficiary. This was not the whole story, but it was a vital chapter. Mr. Croft was moving money. But why? Then her eyes fell upon another section of the ledger detailing the estate's timber sales. The profits were recorded consistently, but as she scanned her own reconstructed tables, she noticed something her father had taught her to look for, a classic sign of skimming. The recorded yields per acre were consistently about 10% lower than the regional average for a healthy forest. 10%, a small enough margin to be dismissed as a poor harvest or inefficient logging. But over thousands of acres, year after year, that missing 10% added up to a fortune that was never entered into the Crimson Ledger at all. It was wealth that existed completely off the books. Eleanor leaned back in the Duke's chair, her eyes fixed on the columns she had created. There were two schemes running in parallel. The first was a complex web of false invoices and padded expenses, a siphoning of funds from within the official accounts. The second was a simpler, bolder theft, the skimming of profits before they were ever recorded. The first was designed to be found eventually by a diligent enough auditor. The second was designed to be invisible forever. She traced a line with her finger down a column of figures she had isolated on her notes. It was a series of payments for stable repairs, all made out to a company she had never heard of. The dates were erratic, but the amounts were always the same, down to the last shilling. It was a ghost company, a phantom created for the sole purpose of receiving stolen money. And the total amount funneled to it over the past year was staggering. As the hours passed, she had uncovered the first definitive thread of a massive, systematic embezzlement scheme. The silence in the Duke's study was no longer a threat. It had become a shield, a vast, quiet space where Eleanor's mind could finally stretch its limbs. For years, her thoughts had been kept in a cramped, dark room, starved of light and air. Now they breathed. The first thread of corruption she had found was a simple overpayment, a clumsy mistake. But she knew that was just the loose end of a much larger tangle. The real fraud would be deeper, woven into the very fabric of the estate's finances with practiced skill. She turned a page in the Crimson Ledger, the heavy paper cool beneath her fingertips. The scent of old leather and ink filled her senses, a perfume of purpose she had not smelled since her father's study. Her eyes scanned columns of figures, her mind a silent, swift calculator, sifting through the mundane entries. Wages for household staff, payments for hay and oats, repairs to the East Wing. It was all meticulously recorded, almost too meticulously, and then she saw it. Under the heading of agricultural improvements, a series of entries caught her attention. Purchase of high-yield seed grain, acquisition of breeding stock. The descriptions were plausible, the sort of expenses a large, productive estate would incur. But there was something wrong with the numbers. They were too clean. 1,000 pounds, 500 pounds, 2,000 pounds, always round, perfect figures. Farming was a messy business. Her father had taught her that. Costs were never so neat. They were a jumble of odd shillings and pence, reflecting the chaotic reality of suppliers, weather, and logistics. These payments, however, were precise, appearing at regular intervals, almost like an allowance or a salary. A cold knot formed in her stomach. This was not about farming. This was a disguise. Silas Croft was moving money, hiding it in plain sight under the most boring category he could find. Eleanor's finger traced the dates of the payments. The 10th of March, the 8th of April, the 12th of May. There was a rhythm to it, a hidden pulse of deceit. Her gaze drifted from the ledger, across the vast expanse of the Duke's desk. A stack of newspapers and journals sat near the edge, left there by a valet. On top was a recent copy of the London Society Gazette, its pages filled with gossip and announcements. It was the kind of publication her stepmother, Beatrice, devoured, her voice dripping with scorn or envy as she read about the fortunes and failures of her peers. An idea, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through Eleanor's concentration. She reached for the Gazette, her hand trembling slightly. It was a wild thought, a desperate leap in the dark, but the neatness of the payments felt personal, calculated. She smoothed the thin paper flat beside the heavy ledger. The lamplight cast a warm golden circle on the desk, creating a small island of discovery in the ocean of shadows. She found the first date in her notes, March 10th, a payment of £1,500 for emergency drainage work. Her eyes scanned the columns of the Gazette from that week. Her breath caught in her throat. A small article on the third page mentioned a disastrous night of cards at the Countess of Ashworth's residence. Several names were listed among the high-stakes players, and there, at the end of the list, was Baroness Beatrice Vance, who had reportedly suffered a spectacular run of ill fortune. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness. It was a coincidence. It had to be. One day, one loss, it could mean nothing. With a growing sense of dread, she looked for the next date, April 8th, a payment of £800 for new fencing for the North Pasture. She flipped through the Gazette for the corresponding week. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A charity auction had been held for the city's orphans. Baroness Vance had made a famously high bid on a diamond necklace, a bid she had won. The article noted her generosity, but whispers in other columns suggested the bid was a desperate attempt to maintain social standing after recent financial embarrassments. The amount of the bid was not listed, but Eleanor knew. She could feel it. The debt had been settled by the Duke's fencing. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern, a sickening, undeniable conspiracy. She worked faster now, a cold fire burning in her veins. Date after date, she found the connection. A large payment for roof repairs on the tenant farms matched the week Beatrice had to settle a massive bill with her dressmaker. A sum for livestock medicine coincided with a notice that the Baroness had finally paid off a long overdue debt to a carriage maker. The Duke's wealth was being systematically siphoned away, not just to enrich his steward, but to paper over the cracks in her stepmother's crumbling facade. Each entry in the ledger was a lie that propped up another lie in Beatrice's life. Eleanor leaned back in the Duke's chair, the leather creaking in the profound silence. The scale of it was breathtaking. Silas Croft was not simply stealing. He was a secret banker for the desperate and the indebted, and his most prominent client was her own stepmother. But why? Croft was a greedy man, not a generous one. He would never take such a risk without a significant reward. What could Beatrice possibly offer him? She had no fortune of her own. Her gowns, her jewels, her social climbing were all financed by debt and cruelty. And then, the final terrible piece of the puzzle fell into place. Her father's will, her inheritance. The fortune that Beatrice had seized, claiming Eleanor was too simple to manage it. The money her stepmother used to maintain her lifestyle was not infinite. Eleanor knew from the documents her father had shown her years ago that, while it was a substantial sum, it could not possibly sustain Beatrice's extravagant spending and gambling losses for long, unless it was being supplemented. Croft was not paying Beatrice's debts out of kindness. He was paying them to create leverage. Beatrice, in turn, must be paying him back. But with what money? It was her money, her inheritance, the funds her father had painstakingly accumulated for her future. Beatrice was using it to pay off Silas Croft, to buy his silence and his continued support in draining the Beaumont estate. Croft got his cut, a steady stream of laundered money from Eleanor's trust. Beatrice got her debts cleared with the Duke's funds, preserving her social standing and allowing her to continue her charade. They were partners, feeding off two separate fortunes, the Duke's and her own. She, Eleanor, was the silent, unwilling investor in her own misery. The thought was so grotesque it almost made her laugh. All those years of being called a fool, an imbecile. All the while, her intelligence, the very legacy her father had given her, was the one thing they were all terrified of. She took a clean sheet of the Duke's heavy parchment and a freshly sharpened quill. The scratching sound was the only noise as she began to write. She did not copy the ledger. She distilled it. She drew lines, connected dates, and noted sums. On one side, Croft's fraudulent entries. On the other, Beatrice's social calendar of ruin. The quill moved with a life of its own, channeling years of suppressed anger and grief into neat, undeniable columns of fact. The pain of the stolen abacus, the sting of public humiliation, the quiet sorrow of her sparse room. Every slight, every cruelty was now being converted into evidence. When she was finished, 3 pages lay on the desk. They contained the complete architecture of a crime, a detailed map of greed and betrayal. It was more than just proof of embezzlement. It was a weapon. She looked at the name she had written over and over: Baroness Beatrice Vance, her tormentor, her jailer, the woman who had tried to erase her. For the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt a sensation that was not fear or sadness. It was power, a cold, clear, and absolute power. She stared at the damning pages, the ink still gleaming in the lamplight. She realized this was not just about saving the Duke's fortune or proving her own worth. This was about justice, a complete and devastating justice that could tear her stepmother's world to pieces. Eleanor stared at the ink on the page. The names, her stepmother's and Silas Croft's, were linked by a chain of false entries. It was a cold, hard fact. The thrill of the chase had faded, replaced by a heavy, painful beat in her chest. This was not triumph. It was the destruction of the woman who had tried to erase her, and the thought brought only a hollow ache. She had made herself the most dangerous person in the house. A floorboard creaked in the corridor. Eleanor froze, her head snapping up from the ledger. It was late. The house was settled into a deep quiet. She held her breath but heard only the sigh of the dying fire. Still, a prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. She was a single point of light in a sea of darkness, a beacon for any restless eyes. Silas Croft was indeed restless. He had retired hours ago, but his mind was a hornet's nest. The Duke's abruptness that afternoon had been unsettling. The way he had summoned Lady Eleanor, the way he had watched her. It was wrong. Croft had built his power on the Duke's apathy and the girl's supposed stupidity. If either of those foundations cracked, everything would collapse. Slipping on a dressing gown, he left his room and moved through the darkened service corridors without a candle. As he neared the West Wing, a faint line of gold appeared under the Duke's study door. Croft stopped. His heart gave a painful lurch. The Duke never worked this late. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He crept closer, his ear pressed against the thick oak. Nothing, just an unnerving silence. Paranoia tightened its grip. He had to see inside. His fingers closed around a cold piece of metal in his pocket. It was the master key, a tool he was not supposed to possess, copied years ago for just such an emergency. This was an emergency. With a hand that trembled slightly, he slid the key into the lock. A barely audible click echoed in the hall. Inside the study, the sound was like a gunshot. Eleanor shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly. Her gaze flew to the door as the heavy brass handle began to turn, slowly. This was not the Duke. The Duke would not sneak into his own study. This was someone who did not belong. The door swung inward with a low groan. Silas Croft stood framed in the doorway, his shadow long and distorted. His eyes adjusted, finding Eleanor first. Then his gaze dropped to the desk. He saw the open ledger, the crimson ledger, his ledger. His eyes widened, and a dark flush crept up his neck. He saw the scattered papers, her neat columns of figures, and understood completely. The mask of the obsequious steward dissolved, revealing the terrified man beneath. His face, usually ruddy, contorted into a snarl. "What are you doing?" The voice was not his polished tone. It was a raw, guttural whisper. "What do you think you are doing, you stupid little girl?" Fear roared in Eleanor's ears, but beneath it, something else kindled. All the years of being called stupid, of being dismissed, coalesced into defiance. She did not answer. Instead, she took a small step back, placing herself between Croft and the desk. She spread her hands flat over her notes and the open ledger, shielding them. Her silence infuriated him. He stepped into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. They were alone. "Did you think you could fool me?" he hissed, advancing on her. "You and your little act." The quiet mouse, "Do you have any idea who you are meddling with?" Eleanor's eyes locked on his. She could smell the stale wine on his breath and see the desperation in his gaze. He was a cornered animal, and she was the one who had closed the trap. She suddenly realized she had nothing left to lose. "The Duke gave you this, didn't he?" Croft's voice cracked. "He suspects. After all this time, he finally suspects." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And he gives his secrets to a little nobody." He was in front of her now, looming over her. Men like him had always used their power to make her feel small. But she was not small tonight. She held all the power, and it was written on the pages beneath her fingertips. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but as cold as ice. "It is over, Mr. Croft." The simple statement struck him like a blow, his face twisted in rage. "You will give me that book," he snarled, his hands shooting out to grab it. Eleanor pressed down harder, her body a shield. "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "You insolent little witch," he roared. He saw her only as an obstacle. His reason fled. He lunged, not just for the book, but for her, his fingers curled to shove her aside. Eleanor braced herself. She closed her eyes for a split second, a lifetime of submission warring with this single moment of rebellion. She would not move. Just as his hand was about to make contact, a deafening crack echoed through the study. The grand double doors flew open, slamming against the walls. Duke Alistair Beaumont stood in the brightly lit doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He wore a severe dark coat, as if for battle. Behind him, the steel gorgets of two household guards glinted. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the cowering steward and the defiant girl. His eyes, cold and blue as glaciers, fixed on Silas Croft. Alistair's face, usually a mask of calm, was like thunder. The heavy oak doors of the study flew open, crashing against the stoppers, with a sound that cracked the tense silence. Duke Alistair Beaumont stood framed in the doorway, his large form blocking the dim light from the hall. His face was not merely angry. It was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his eyes promising a quiet and terrible reckoning. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Silas Croft was caught, his hand outstretched, his face a twisted mess of surprise and primal fear. Eleanor stood her ground, her body a shield for the crimson ledger, her own fear eclipsed by a wave of defiant adrenaline. She had been found, but so had he. Alistair's voice, when it came, was dangerously low. It cut through the air like a shard of glass. He did not even look at Croft. His gaze was fixed on the two guards who stood silently behind him. "Remove him!" The order was absolute, devoid of any emotion but finality. The guards stepped forward, their movements efficient and impersonal. Croft seemed to shrink, his blustering rage collapsing into panicked desperation. "Your Grace," he stammered, his eyes darting between Alistair and the approaching men. "Your Grace, listen to me. This is a misunderstanding. She is the deceiver, a conniving little liar who—" His words were cut short as each guard took one of his arms in a grip of iron. Croft struggled, his portly body twisting uselessly. "You cannot believe her. She is an unlettered simpleton. Everyone knows it." His voice rose to a desperate shriek as they began to pull him from the room. Alistair did not flinch. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as if observing the removal of a distasteful piece of furniture. The steward's protests echoed down the long stone corridor, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the vast, silent house. Then there was only the sound of the heavy door clicking shut, plunging the study back into an intimate, charged quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. The scent of beeswax and old paper seemed to reassert itself. The fire in the grate had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing light on the rich wood and rows of leather-bound books. Eleanor felt the last of her adrenaline drain away, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion. Her legs trembled, and she had to place a hand on the desk to steady herself. For hours, her mind had been a whirlwind of numbers and connections, a storm of focused energy. Now the storm had passed, leaving a stillness so complete it felt fragile, as if a single word could shatter it. She looked at the Duke. He had not moved from his position by the door, and the shadows still hid his expression. She could feel his eyes on her, a gaze that was no longer just suspicious or intrigued, but something far more intense and difficult to name. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, slowed to a heavy, painful thud. This was the moment. All the calculations, all the cross-referencing, all the fear and the secret hope had led to this single point in time. She had found the truth, but now she had to deliver it. Her throat was dry, and for a terrifying second she feared she would be unable to speak, that her stepmother's cruelest lie would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Drawing a ragged breath, Eleanor pushed herself away from the desk. She did not point to the chaotic, ink-stained pages of the Crimson Ledger. That was the raw material, the battlefield. What she had created was the map of her victory. She walked to the far side of the desk where she had spent the last hour of her work. There, laid out with perfect precision, were 3 sheets of the Duke's own heavy cream-colored paper. Using his pen and a small bottle of ink, she had distilled a year of elaborate deception into a summary of absolute clarity. Her handwriting, a skill her father had insisted she perfect, was small, neat, and ruthlessly efficient. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she picked up the 3 pages. She walked back across the Obusan carpet, its rich patterns muted in the low light. The soft rustle of the paper was the only sound in the room. She stopped before Alistair and held them out. She did not offer an explanation or an apology. The work had to speak for itself. It had to speak for her. Alistair finally moved. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the tension in his body palpable. He did not take the papers from her immediately. Instead, his gaze dropped to her hands. He saw the ink stains on her fingertips, the slight tremor she could no longer control. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the paleness of her skin in the firelight. This was not the timid, frightened girl who had hid in corners. This was a soldier who had just survived a grueling battle. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and in their depths she saw the last remnants of his cold fury warring with a dawning astonishment. He took the papers from her. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting instant, a spark of warmth in the cool air that made her draw a sharp, silent breath. He turned and walked back to the desk, placing the sheets directly under the soft glow of the oil lamp. Eleanor remained standing, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her. She watched his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way a single muscle twitched near his temple. She felt as if her entire life, her past and her future, were being weighed and judged in the silence of this room. She could hear her own blood pulsing in her ears, a slow, heavy drumbeat marking time. He read the first page. She knew what it contained. A concise, brutal summary. The total amount stolen from the Beaumont estate over the last 18 months. A figure so large it was breathtaking. Below it, a list of the 5 fictitious companies Croft had created, complete with the dates of their establishment. Alistair's posture did not change, but Eleanor saw his knuckles turn white where his hand rested on the desk. He was a man accustomed to control, to order. This was a violation of his world on a scale he had clearly never imagined. He moved to the second page. This was the architecture of the fraud. Eleanor had detailed Croft's methods with painstaking precision, how he disguised massive withdrawals as mundane agricultural supply orders, how he manipulated grain prices between the estate's own properties, skimming a percentage from every transaction. She had drawn a small, neat chart linking ghost employees' salaries to a bank account Croft himself controlled. It was a complex web of deceit, but on the page, she had rendered it stark and simple. She watched as Alistair traced one of the lines with his finger, his movements slow and deliberate. He was not just reading. He was absorbing the sheer audacity of the betrayal, the treachery of a man who had eaten at his table and managed his fortune for over a decade. Then he turned to the third and final page. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was the most dangerous part. This was where the fraud intersected with her own life, her own private misery. At the top of the page, in her clear script, was the name, Baroness Beatrice Vance. Behind was a column of dates. Next to that, a column of figures. And in the final column, a notation from the Society Gazettes she had found, detailing which of her stepmother's significant gambling debts had been settled within days of each payment from the Duke's accounts. It was not an accusation. It was a sequence of undeniable facts. The money flowed from the Duke's estate through Silas Croft and directly to the creditors of the woman who had publicly called Eleanor a fool. Alistair stood perfectly still for a long time, his eyes fixed on that third page. The name on the paper seemed to burn in the lamplight. He had witnessed Beatrice's cruelty firsthand. He had seen her humiliate Eleanor, had felt a deep-seated revulsion for her casual malice. But this was different. This was not just social cruelty. This was a criminal conspiracy. It was a revelation that recontextualized everything, exposing a rot that went far deeper than he had suspected. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken implications. The fire had almost died completely now, and the room was growing cold. Finally, he set the pages down, aligning their edges with perfect precision. The anger had receded from his face. The shock had settled. What remained was a profound, quiet, and completely undisguised admiration. It was in the way the hard lines around his mouth softened. It was in the way his eyes, when they finally rose to meet hers, held a muppety now in startling light. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if for the first time. He saw not a pitiable victim or a curious anomaly, but a mind of breathtaking clarity and power. He took a slow breath, the first easy breath either of them had taken since he had entered the room. His voice, when he spoke, was soft. It held none of his ducal authority, none of his earlier anger. It was simply the voice of one human being speaking to another in shared and stunned discovery. He looked from the papers to her face and said, "You have done in one night what I could not do in a year." His words echoed in her mind. "You have done in one night what I could not do in a year." Eleanor had barely slept, her mind replaying the Duke's undisguised admiration. It felt more unreal than the numbers in the ledger. Now, standing in the grand salon, she felt like a ghost. The fragile sense of victory had evaporated, replaced by a familiar, chilling anxiety. The air was thick with lilies and expensive perfume. Eleanor clutched a teacup she did not want, her knuckles white. She could feel her stepmother's gaze from across the room. Baroness Beatrice Vance was holding court, her laughter sharp and brittle. Beatrice's eyes held a new contempt, a suspicion that made Eleanor's stomach clench. When the salon doors opened, conversations faltered. Duke Alastair Beaumont stood on the threshold, his dark coat severe, his face impassive. He commanded the room without a word. His gaze swept over the nobles before it landed briefly, almost imperceptibly, on Eleanor. For a single second, she felt seen, anchored. Then he moved toward the center of the room as silence deepened with anticipation. "My apologies for the interruption," Alastair began, his voice calm yet carrying to every corner. "I have an announcement of a rather serious nature." He paused. "As of this morning, my steward, Silas Croft, is no longer in my employ. He has been taken into the custody of the magistrate." A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a rush of whispers. From her circle of ladies, Beatrice let out a theatrical sigh. "Oh, dear Duke," she called out, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "How dreadful for you. These sorts of men, they are so grasping, are they not? It is a failure of character we of quality simply cannot comprehend." She cast a sideways glance at Eleanor, a subtle, dismissive look. It was meant to put her back in her place. Eleanor felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, wanting to shrink into the wallpaper behind her, but Alistair's gaze turned to ice. He looked directly at Baroness Vance, his polite mask falling away. "You are mistaken, Baroness," he said, his voice dropping with chilling precision. This was not simple greed. It was a complex and deeply embedded scheme of embezzlement, a fraud so sophisticated it went undetected for years. He let the new shockwave spread, then his gaze left Beatrice and swept the room until it found Eleanor again. "The deception was masterful," he continued, his tone shifting from anger to something deliberate. "It was hidden in ledgers, disguised as legitimate expenses. Unraveling it required more than just diligence. It required a truly singular intellect." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel every eye in the room begin to shift, following the Duke's line of sight toward her corner. "It required a mind capable of seeing the patterns others miss," Alistair declared. He took a step, then another, beginning a slow walk across the carpet. Each footfall seemed to mark a beat of Eleanor's frantic pulse. The whispers died. He was closing the distance between the center of their world and her lonely periphery. He did not stop until he was standing directly before her. The entire room held its breath. Eleanor could only stare up at him, trapped in the intensity of his blue eyes. They were not cold now, but filled with a quiet, unwavering respect. "That singular intellect," he announced to the silent crowd, "belongs to Lady Eleanor Vance." A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the salon. Eleanor heard a teacup clatter as someone dropped it. Across the room, Beatrice's painted smile froze. Alistair gave her no time to recover. He extended his hand to Eleanor in a clear, undeniable offer. It was a public declaration. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, "will you permit me?" Time seemed to slow. She looked at his outstretched arm. It was a lifeline. It was a validation. It was a weapon against years of humiliation. She could feel the searing heat of her stepmother's stare, a desperate command to refuse. But last night something had broken inside her. She had earned this. Slowly, Eleanor placed her teacup on a nearby table. Her hand trembled, but her resolve was iron. She met her stepmother's eyes across the room with a quiet finality, then turned back to Alistair. Lifting her chin, she placed her hand on his arm. The wool was fine, the muscle beneath it solid and warm. As her fingers rested on his sleeve, Alistair covered her hand briefly with his own, a gesture of quiet confirmation. He then turned, with Eleanor securely on his arm, to face the assembly. He had drawn a line in the sand, shattering the cruel rumors that had followed her for years. Beatrice stared, her face a mask of absolute horror. The color drained from her cheeks. She saw the girl she had systematically shamed standing beside the most powerful man in the room, with respect in his eyes. And in that instant, she understood. The money trail Eleanor uncovered would not stop with Croft. It would lead to her own gambling debts. Beatrice Vance was ruined. Baroness Beatrice stood frozen, the whispers in the grand hall no longer about Eleanor's supposed simplicity. They were for her. The gazes that once held pity for Eleanor now turned on Beatrice with cold judgment. She had built her world on lies, and with a few quiet words from the Duke, it had all crumbled. Eleanor watched, not with triumph, but with a strange, hollow quiet inside her. It was the silence after a long and terrible storm. The days that followed were a blur of legal formalities made swift by Duke Alistair Beaumont's influence. His lawyers were precise, armed with the irrefutable proof Eleanor had uncovered. Beatrice did not fight. Stripped of her credibility, she acquiesced to every term. Eleanor sat through meetings in an office that smelled of dry paper and sealing wax, her voice clear and steady when she spoke. She watched as signatures transferred ownership, and as the wealth her father had built for her was finally returned. One afternoon, from a window at Beaumont Hall, Eleanor saw a simple carriage pull away. Inside, a woman in a plain cloak sat rigidly, her face turned away. It was Beatrice. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, ignominious departure. Eleanor felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of pity, nor of joy. It was for the years that were minute, for the girl who had to hide her mind behind a veil of silence. The past was finally behind her. Several weeks passed. The early autumn sun warmed the stone terraces of Beaumont Hall. The tension that had filled its corridors seemed to have evaporated. Eleanor walked beside Alistair through the rose gardens, the scent of late blooms thick in the air. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, but for the first time, it was a choice, not a necessity. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived for years in her stomach had finally begun to loosen. Alistair had been quieter than usual. He led her toward a stone bench overlooking the rolling hills of the estate. He stopped in front of her, his expression serious, but the hardness in his features was gone. It was replaced by something softer. He reached into his coat pocket. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice low. He opened his hand, and resting on his palm was her miniature silver abacus. The ivory beads gleamed, polished and perfect. The sight of it made her breath catch. It was a piece of her soul, the last tangible gift from her father. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to take it. The cool weight of the silver felt like coming home. She looked up at Alistair, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "How did you?" she whispered. "I made sure my solicitors recovered all personal effects that were unlawfully taken," he explained simply. "I recognized it from the description you once gave me, of the father who taught you everything." He saw it not as a trinket, but as the key to who she was. Eleanor clutched the abacus to her chest, a wave of profound gratitude washing over her. For so long, her intellect had been a danger, a secret to be guarded. Now it was the very thing that had earned her the respect of this discerning man. She looked at him and saw not just a duke, but a partner, an ally who had seen through the rumors. He did not look away. The silence between them was filled with everything that had gone unsaid. "Eleanor Vaz," he began, and the use of her name made her heart beat faster. "The estate is in disarray. Croft's mismanagement runs deeper than I imagined. He gestured toward the fields. It needs a brilliant mind to oversee its recovery. Someone who can see what others miss. He paused, his blue eyes holding hers. But it is more than that. He took a step closer, closing the small space between them. He gently took the hand that was not clutching the abacus. His fingers were strong and warm around hers. Beaumont Hall does not just need a steward, Eleanor. His voice dropped, becoming softer. I need someone I can trust, completely. After years of deception, I find that is a rarer commodity than gold. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them on that stone terrace. It was not a business proposition. It was a confession. A genuine smile, slow and radiant, finally broke through the sadness that had clouded her features for years. It was a smile that reached her gray eyes, lighting them from within with a brilliant warmth. The ghosts of her past were silent. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. She felt the solid ground beneath her feet. She felt the hope of a life she could finally build for herself. Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, her answer not in words, but in the simple, profound pressure of her touch.